So in today's video, we're going to take a look at the latest firmware update from DJI, which is the DJI FLY app 1.9.1 and the DJI RC update, which is 01.02.0300. Now we're going to test out this firmware here in Europe and see if there is any significant changes to the drone after updating to the latest firmware. We're also going to see if this firmware has fixed my two major issues which I've recently had to the Mini 3 Pro and the DJI RC controller. Now, a lot of you might know that I've had a lot of lag with the DJI RC controller, and this is something that I didn't experience when I first got this, but I can understand with more firmware updates coming through the device here, filling it up, it will eventually start to lag a little bit more. And the same is if you have a computer, the more it fills up, the sooner it will start to lag. And it's the same with the DJI RC controller as well. But it seems with this latest firmware that DJI have corrected that, because I can't seem to have any major lag issues with the DJI RC controller, which I'm really excited about. Now, I didn't want to push this out as soon as the firmware dropped because I wanted to test it a little bit deeper since I had some issues with the Mini 3 Pro itself as well, and to see if the firmware have corrected that in the long run. And I must say I am quite impressed with the result. So my biggest issue with the DJI Mini 3 Pro itself from the previous firmware update was that the drone automatically started to ascend and increase in altitude when I was flying forward. You can see the example right here when I'm pushing the stick forward and I'm not controlling the altitude of the drone at all, but it automatically starts to ascend, which is pretty strange. And I guess it had something to do with the avoidance sensors or the overall sensors of the drone. So when the drone was pushed forward, it kept on rising even when there wasn't any obstacles nearby. So this could potentially be a big safety problem for the drone if I were to fly closer or through objects. So my only option was actually to keep the left stick pulled slightly down to even out the automatically ascend, which I happen to have with my Mini 3 Pro. Now, what I also found to help was to turn off the obstacle avoidance sensors. Once I turned this off, I could easily pull the drone forward and nothing happened, as you can see in the shot right here. So it's obviously some issues with the avoidance sensors that I had on my Mini 3 Pro unit. And if you had the same experience, or if you haven't updated to the latest firmware yet, take your drone out and go and check if you have the same issue, and then see if you have this corrected once you update to the latest firmware. But after updating to the latest firmware myself, I can see that this has not been fixed and I have no issues with the drone ascending on its own. So updating to this firmware, I see no difference in the overall flight experience and the drone is behaving completely normal. If anything, maybe it's actually a little bit smoother than the previous version. Now, as of taking photos, there is no difference there either. And the changes from the horizontal to vertical mode, it is as smooth as always. And when it comes to taking videos, there's no change. Everything is as before and the image coming from this drone looks just amazing. And as for the intelligent flight modes, there's no change here either. As you can see here, doing a standard point of interest, the drone is circling perfectly without any issues. And for quick shots, we have the same performance as expected, so no issues here. So I can strongly recommend updating to this firmware. When it comes to settings, when you're out shooting your videos with your Mini 3 Pro, everyone has their own preferences. But let me show you the setup that I used for capturing these shots, which you just saw. So starting with the safety section here, obstacle avoidance, always on, of course, and I've set this to bypass so I don't have any unnecessary brakes when I'm flying towards objects. Sideways flying is off. If this is enabled, you won't be enabled to fly from side to side, as I showed you an example of in my previous video. And if you haven't checked that, I highly recommend you doing so, where I give you 15 settings and tips you need to change right now to get the best out of this drone. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below if you want to check it out. The next is the altitude, and I've set this to 120 meters, which is the max altitude allowed here in Norway. Now this can be changed depending on where you fly, but in most countries and areas the limit is 120 meters, so I don't recommend going higher than that. And return to home altitude is set to 100 meters, but I usually change this depending on the environment I'm flying in, but usually keep it between 90 and 100 meters. Now let's take a quick look at the control section and button customization. This this is quite individual to every pilot and what they prefer the buttons to do. But I've set my custom buttons to cruise control and portrait mode, and this gives me a good combo for shooting amazing footage with this drone. The next tab is going to be camera and the video section. I shoot my videos in MOV since I'm working with Apple devices, and of course the Cine-like to get the 10-bit colors. Now I don't recommend shooting your videos above 30 FPS because you're not going to get that 10-bit colors and the best quality out of this drone. And 30 FPS in a 24 FPS timeline is still good enough and will give you the ability to slow down the clip to 80% to have a smoother look. Now as for codec, I mainly use H.264. Now what I've also done here is to turn off the subtitles because it takes up unnecessary storage. Not that the files are huge at all, they're only like 1 kilobyte or 2 kilobytes or whatever, but it just adds additional files to the SD card, which I don't need. So I recommend turning this off if you don't need the flight data coming from the recordings. And of course, what I mean everyone should have enabled is both histogram and overexposure warnings. I recently made a full video on this topic and I will leave it down in the description below if you want to check it out to learn more about how to properly expose with your drone. Now when it comes to styles, where you add your sharpness on how sharp you want the image to be and also how much noise reduction you want to have, I always keep my sharpness on -1 because I prefer to control the sharpness myself in post. The noise reduction is set to 0 or 1, but this also depends on the situation I'm filming in, so I'm not always changing this up, but in most situations I leave this on 0. So there you have a rundown of the newest firmware for the Mini 3 Pro and the RC controller, and it has definitely fixed the issue that I had with the DJI Mini 3 Pro ascending on its own. So I'm really stoked about that. And also, which probably has been my biggest issue, is the RC controller lagging. This now seems to be fixed and I haven't experienced any major issues with that. So really safe to update to the latest firmware update, and I don't see any changes to the behavior of flying in the Mini 3 Pro or using the RC controller. So that's going to be everything for today. Make sure to update to the latest firmware. You're definitely going to do yourself a favor, especially if you had some minor lag to your controller and if you had your Mini 3, automatically ascending for some reason. Really hope that you enjoyed it, and let me know if you have any questions related to the RC controller or the Mini 3 Pro. Drop them down in the comment section below. And with that said, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.